The most dangerous war in human history has never been fought, and yet it continues to define every major global decision to this day. The United States didn't win the Cold War with just tanks or soldiers. They won with decisions made behind closed doors, based on fear, cold calculation, and a question that never went away. What happens if someone makes a mistake? This video is not about the past. It's about why the world still lives under rules created by Washington more than 70 years ago, and why they continue to work for now. If you value true history, documented decisions, and the impact they still have today, like and subscribe now. This channel exists to remind us why certain choices cannot be repeated. Nothing has frightened the modern world more than the realization made in August 1945. War had ceased to be a dispute over territory and had become a threat to human existence. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, the United States not only ended World War II in the Pacific, they inaugurated a new strategic era, an era in which ultimate power lay no longer in the size of the army, but in the ability to end the war before it even began. For the American public, it is impossible to understand the 21st century without understanding this moment. Until 1945, history followed a familiar pattern: long wars, millions dead, reconstruction, and then the next war. What changed that summer was not only the scale of the destruction, but the speed and irreversibility. In seconds, a city ceased to exist. There were no front lines. There was no time for reaction. And for the first time, American strategists themselves realized something unsettling. If this weapon spread, no defense would be sufficient. The fear that arose there wasn't just of the enemy. It was of the future. Inside Washington, civilian and military leaders quickly understood that the United States had crossed a point of no return. The victory was real, but the psychological cost was profound. Official reports, congressional debates, and documents from the early Cold War show a silent consensus. That weapon could not become just another option on the battlefield. If that happened, the world would enter a cycle of destruction impossible to control. This is a crucial point that many narratives ignore. Nuclear fear didn't begin in Moscow. It began in the United States itself. It began when scientists from the Manhattan Project warned that the technology could not be uninvented. It began when strategists realized that American nuclear supremacy would be temporary. And it began when it became clear that, in the next war, there would be no clear winners, only survivors, if any. That is why 1945 is not just the end of a war. It is the birth of a strategic trauma that still governs global politics. From that moment on, every American military decision carried an invisible question. Does this bring the world closer to or further away from annihilation? This fear shaped alliances, redefined the role of the president as supreme commander, and transformed the White House into the nerve center of global security. And here's the connection that underpins the rest of this video. Fear didn't paralyze the United States. It compelled them to lead. To lead not just with force, but with restraint. To lead knowing that one mistake could mean the end of everything. This tension between absolute power and absolute responsibility was born in 1945 and has never disappeared. Now I want to know from you. Do you believe the world has truly learned a lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or has it merely postponed the next mistake? Leave your comment, because it is precisely this question that will lead us to the next topic, where a decision made far from the battlefield changed the logic of war forever. The most important decision of the Cold War didn't involve troops, tanks, or bombs falling from the sky. It happened quietly, in closed rooms in Washington, when the United States reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Winning a nuclear war would mean losing everything. This moment marks a radical turning point in American military history, the instant when the world's greatest power decided that the full use of its force would, paradoxically, be its greatest failure. In the late 1940s, American nuclear superiority seemed absolute. The United States held a monopoly on the most devastating weapon ever created. The strategic temptation was clear. Use this advantage to impose order, prevent rivals from growing, and end conflicts before they began. But within the Pentagon and the White House, one question began to dominate analysis. What happens when the enemy also has the bomb? This was not a distant hypothesis. It was a mathematical certainty. When the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon in 1949, the world officially entered uncharted territory. The American response was not to accelerate a preemptive war, as many feared, but to build something far colder and more complex. A strategy based not on victory, but on calculated fear. This gave rise to the logic of nuclear deterrence, the idea that the best way to avoid war is to ensure that it is impossible to win. This choice redefined everything. Instead of seeking the destruction of the enemy, the United States began investing in the capability for a second strike. Nuclear submarines hidden in the oceans, intercontinental missiles in reinforced silos, strategic bombers on constant alert. The message was simple and brutal. Even if America were hit first, a response would be inevitable. There would be no escape. There would be no glory. Only mutual annihilation. This is where the concept that still controls global politics was born. Mutually assured destruction. A system so terrifying that its very existence should prevent its use. Washington understood that balance would not come from trust, but from the certainty of the worst possible scenario. And contrary to what many believe, this was not weakness. It was an extreme form of strategic self-control. But this decision carried a flaw that few were willing to discuss openly. Deterrence assumes rational leaders, infallible systems, and perfect communication. It ignores the human factor. It ignores error. It ignores chance. By accepting this logic, the United States gambled that fear would be more reliable than diplomacy and more constant than emotion. It worked, but at an invisible cost. This model transformed the role of the American president into something unprecedented. Never before had a single individual concentrated so much destructive power in such a short time. From that point on, every international crisis began to be analyzed not by the immediate political risk, but by the possibility of nuclear escalation. War ceased to be an extension of politics. It became its ultimate collapse. And here's the question that connects this topic to the next. If world peace came to depend on systems that could never fail, what happened when they almost failed? Leave your comment, because in the next chapter, we'll delve into the real moments when the world was minutes away from the end, not by conscious decision, but by mistake, silence, or disobedience. If nuclear deterrence worked, it wasn't because the system was perfect. It worked because, at some of the most dangerous moments in modern history, someone decided not to follow protocol. That's the most unsettling detail of the Cold War, and what frightens American strategists even today. The world didn't survive because everything went right. It survived because, by chance, there was time. October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not merely a political confrontation between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. It was the moment when the logic of deterrence was pushed to its absolute limit. For the first time, nuclear weapons were positioned just minutes from the continental United States. Soviet submarines, bombers on high alert, American forces ready to attack. Every decision made in Washington could trigger an unstoppable sequence of events. What the public rarely realizes is how fragile everything was. Communication was flawed. Information was incomplete. Extreme psychological pressure. At least once, at one critical moment, Soviet officers on a submarine, surrounded by American forces, believed the war had already begun. Protocol allowed for the launch of a nuclear torpedo. All it took was unanimity. It didn't happen. A single officer refused to agree, and the world continued to exist. And this was not an isolated case. During the Cold War, the United States recorded multiple false nuclear attack alerts. In some instances, radar systems indicated non-existent launches. In others, technical failures transformed solar reflections into enemy missiles. In each situation, the chain of command had minutes, sometimes seconds, to decide whether the end of the world was real or just a mistake. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The American strategy presupposed absolute rationality under conditions of maximum stress. But war is not a mathematical exercise. It's a human environment, chaotic and imperfect. The system worked not because it was infallible, but because people, trained to push the button, chose not to. That is the central contradiction of nuclear peace. These near disasters were never intended for the public. Many only came to light decades later, in declassified documents and belated testimonies. And when they do emerge, they reveal something disturbing. The world was minutes away from the end, not because of political ambition, but because of technical error, misinterpretation, or silence at the wrong time. For the United States, these episodes reinforced a harsh lesson. The greatest threat to national security came not only from the enemy, but from the very system created to prevent war. Deterrence avoided direct conflict, but introduced a new risk, that of entrusting the fate of humanity to warnings, codes, and decisions made under extreme pressure. And this is where I want to hear from you. Do you think humanity survived the Cold War through strategy or luck? Leave your comment, because in the next topic we'll show how these mistakes shaped modern global politics, and why nuclear fear never really disappeared. It just changed form. The Cold War ended on paper, but not strategically. The biggest mistake when analyzing the current world is believing that nuclear fear belongs to the past. It hasn't disappeared. It has simply become quieter, more technical, and much more integrated into Washington's daily decisions. The system created to prevent the end of the world hasn't been dismantled. It has been updated. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many Americans believed that the nuclear threat had been neutralized along with the ideological enemy. But inside the Pentagon, the interpretation was different. The question was no longer who will attack us, but who can miss. Because the logic of deterrence doesn't depend on intentions, it depends on capability. And nuclear capability doesn't disappear with treaties or speeches. Today, American foreign policy still revolves around the same axis created decades ago, ensuring that no adversary believes it can win a direct confrontation. That is why NATO is not just a conventional military alliance. It is, in practice, a collective nuclear shield. Each new country integrated into the bloc alters strategic calculations in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. It's not about immediate war. It's about psychological equilibrium. Modern Russia understands this profoundly. Even with limited conventional forces, its nuclear power guarantees global strategic relevance. China follows the same path, quietly expanding its arsenal while avoiding direct confrontations. North Korea does not seek military parity. It seeks political survival through deterrence. And Iran represents precisely the point of maximum tension in the system. The fear not of attack, but of proliferation. For the United States, this means living in a permanent paradox. The country invests trillions to ensure that weapons that should never be used continue to function perfectly. Nuclear submarines patrol the oceans without ever making headlines. Missile silos remain active not to launch attacks, but to ensure that no one dares to try. The American military budget is not just about force, it's about credibility. And here's the direct connection to the near disasters of the past. Every mistake avoided during the Cold War reinforced the obsession with absolute control. More protocols, more redundancy, more automation, but also less room for human improvisation. Today's world is more technological, faster, and paradoxically more fragile. A false alarm now spreads in seconds. A wrong decision can escalate before diplomacy can even breathe. Nuclear fear, therefore, is not an ancient ghost. It is the invisible foundation of the international order. It explains why certain wars never happen, why others are fought by proxy, why some lines are never crossed, and why, when they are, the world holds its breath. Now I ask you, do you believe that this balance is still under control, or are we placing too much trust in a system created for a world that no longer exists? Leave your comment, because in the next and final topic, we will face the ultimate question. If this system depends on fear to function, what happens when fear is no longer enough? There's a reason why no major nuclear power speaks lightly about pushing the button. It's not just fear of the enemy. It's fear of history itself. The system that holds the world together today wasn't born of peace, but of trauma. And at the center of that system is the United States, not as the villain, not as the savior, but as the architect of an order that functions only as long as everyone remembers what's at stake. American pride in this context comes not from destruction, but from restraint. Few nations in history have had enough power to end the world, and even fewer have chosen not to do so repeatedly. American presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, have faced moments when full force was available and chose to back down, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. the understanding that some victories are too irreversible to be called victories. But here is the warning that concludes this story. Fear-based systems only work as long as fear is respected. Nuclear deterrence depends on historical memory, on leaders who understand the human cost behind strategic plans, and on societies that do not treat war as an abstraction. When the distance between decision and consequence seems too great, error becomes possible again. Today's world is more complex than that of the Cold War. More actors, more weapons, more technology, less time to decide. Artificial intelligence speeds up alerts. Digital communication amplifies crises. Trust between powers diminishes. And yet, the central system remains the same, ensuring that no one believes they can win a total war. It's a fragile balance, sustained not by hope, but by memory. For the United States, this means carrying a permanent historical weight, to lead not only through military might, but through strategic responsibility, to teach, by example, that unlimited force is not force, it is collapse. Every treaty signed, every red line drawn, every crisis managed away from the headlines is part of this invisible legacy. And perhaps that is the most difficult lesson for the present. Nuclear peace is not comfortable. It offers no happy endings. It demands constant vigilance, historical humility, and the awareness that human error has never been eliminated, only postponed. The world did not end in the 20th century because someone, somewhere, decided to stop, think, and remember. This video is not a warning against technology, nor against national defense. It is a warning against forgetting. When history becomes mere entertainment, when past decisions seem too distant, the system begins to crack. And cracks, in a nuclear world, give no prior warning. In closing, I leave you with the question that sums it all up. Do you believe that future generations will understand the weight of these decisions, or are we living off the moral credit of leaders who are gone? Leave your comment, because understanding this story isn't about looking back. It's about ensuring it never has to repeat itself.